Good afternoon. Um, this afternoon or this evening, wherever you are, I'm presenting on hate speech in library meeting rooms, primarily in public library meeting rooms is what we'll be discussing tonight, and the ethical dilemma that is involved as far as professional librarianship is concerned. So to begin, we need to discuss a little bit about how this came about, and of course this has been a problem for a while, but much of the discussion regarding hate group usage of public library meeting rooms came up in mid-2017. The American Library Association has a number of articles specifically to support the Library Bill of Rights, one in particular on meeting rooms, that they updated to include the words hate groups among the list of protected classes of people who might ask to use such a group. And once that amendment was adapted, and somewhat before too, a number of groups, especially those affiliated with library science and social justice, became very upset. Most were upset at the language change. They felt it was an invitation to allow hate groups in and to create conflict in libraries, which is understandable. There were also some who called for the removal of hate groups and hate speech from libraries altogether. That, of course, is challenging. And eventually the ALA did rescind its changes and revised the document. Now, what's interesting here is that this didn't solve the problem. As far as the American Library Association is concerned, hate groups do have the legal right to use a public library meeting room in support of various laws and amendments. First Amendment. It is challenging for libraries to allow otherwise with the definition of what a public forum is, or a limited public forum, as many libraries are defined. So the conflict still exists here. So to understand a little bit more about these values in conflict, we need to recognize some of those intrinsic pieces in library science. So one, of course, is access. So the American Library Association has a number of core values in librarianship, and in this in this case, the core value of access asks that libraries provide everything, and it should be readily, equally, and equitably accessible to all library users. So that would be anybody in the community, really, as far as a public library is concerned. And in contrast, or additionally, let's say, and more recently in 2021, the American Library Association updated its Code of Ethics to more clearly represent social justice in libraries. And some of that required principles to be adopted that have libraries work to confront inequity and oppression, to advance racial and social justice in a number of places, including libraries, communities, the profession, and associations through awareness, advocacy, education, collaboration services, and this is the pivotal one, allocation of resources and spaces. And of course, spaces definitely would include a public library meeting space. So, and again, when we're talking about access, it's important that there are two types of access being discussed here. One is the access of a hate group to use a public space. Tax dollars have paid for that space, and they should have the right to access it. So if they're not allowed to, their access is removed. But then, of course, if you allow hate groups to use libraries, access is compromised for marginalized groups, especially hate groups, or especially groups that hate groups are actively working to silence, or in many cases destroy. So how can you balance access and social justice in this way? It's a very challenging dilemma. So to step back, we need to talk about some various frameworks that exist ethically, and there are a number that I think fit this well, but the one that I think is specifically good with a solution is the idea of consequentialism. So just to step back, consequentialism is an ethical philosophy in response to deontology. So deontology leans on the idea that your actions in itself are what is how you know if something is good or bad. So it's the action that determines if something is ethically right or wrong. Consequentialism takes actions out of the equation and responds that it is, of course you can see by the word consequentialism, the consequences that determine if something is good or bad, not the actions themselves. It's important that a key component of this, obviously, because it's consequences, you can't always know what a consequence is going to be. So in doing so, you need to focus on choices that maximize good and minimize harm. And that's something we're going to be relying on very importantly here in just a moment. And trying to anticipate what consequences might be to the best of your ability. That is how you can determine what is good and what is bad. Now, this gets challenging when we apply it to this particular dilemma. So if we are focusing on the idea that we need to maximize good and minimize harm, we need to look at some potential actions that may have consequences. So one of those, the first one that is the most obvious that has been supplied by many people, is that libraries should remove hate speech and hate groups from libraries. Now, there are legal ramifications for doing so, of course, but even without that, it has been shown again and again that censoring hate groups is something that hate groups want public spaces to do and other entities to do, because they can use it as a defense legally. It is something that makes them stronger. It is something that they can use as a rallying cry for recruitment. And it allows them to pretend to be a marginalized group. And that's an important distinction. So for the sake of argument, let's assume that censorship is not going to produce good here. Let's move forward from that. So let's take another step here, and let's talk about what does the meeting room as a public forum, what positive goal, what positive goods are we trying to get out of such an enterprise? So in this case, a safe space for community groups or people to come together, to gather together. The free exchange of information, ideas, discussion to help a community grow and learn from each other. And a place where safety can be assured, because not everybody has a safe space in a community in which to come together or gather. So those are important goals here. And of course, what we're dealing with is the idea of a hate group taking these good goals and twisting them into something negative and harmful. So one of the primary ways that has been proposed to, in this case, it fits very well with consequentialism, because the goal is to minimize the harm that a hate group being allowed to use the library could do. And the idea is writing a meeting room policy that is neutral. Now, I do not speak of the term neutral as in we need to allow everybody to access and everybody, we just let harm and good exist how they may. That's not what I'm talking about here. The idea of a neutral meeting room policy are a specific set of standards that are applied across the board. That is the part that is neutral. But the standards are written in a way to minimize the harm of, in this case, hate groups, and maximize the good. So maximizing the good by minimizing all the rules and regulations and stuff that a good quality community group would need access to in a meeting room. So I personally believe that this is the best way to combat the idea of a hate group using a library space, which is just, in my opinion, a horrific thing and very, very difficult. So as we're writing these neutral policies, we need, as all good consequentialists do, we need to anticipate as best we can. We cannot know what will work for sure, but our goal again is to minimize harm and maximize good through the way that these standards are applied. So in doing so, it's just important to recognize that we will not always be successful. So also in this policy, we need to have the ability to readdress it and come back to it and have a process involved that allows us to touch in on whether or not we are being successful. So that will also be part of this policy. So when we look at the actual policy here, we need to start with a basic statement of intent. In this case, the public library meeting room supports community engagement by providing safe spaces for educational, informational, culturally significant, and civic meetings. It's been written in a specific way with specific language to provide a positive purpose for libraries. The second thing we need to do is we need to define who is being instructed. And it's important that we, in this case, for a public meeting room in a library that is needing every bit of space it can get for various events and things, that we separate library usage from public usage. This is something that came up in a conference that I went to at PLA that I thought was particularly interesting, making sure that the policy includes protections for the library to do things that may be a little different than how we are requiring to do it for the public. That way there's not a double standard there. So in this case, this meeting room is not going to allow sales, but it is allowing for library usage, raising of money and fundraising for library purposes only. So this first part here is just talking about library usage. And before we get to the public usage, I also want to mention that having a standard code of conduct, a behavioral code, it's called many different things in many different places, that allows, whether it's in the library or the meeting room, standards of behavior that must be met by all folks. This is already something that is a neutral way to approach difficult issues in public libraries. So when we talk about public use of the meeting room, remember we're trying to apply these standards in a way to everyone, that's the neutral part, in a way that minimizes harms and maximizes good. So in this case, we are specifically identifying that the meeting room must be open to all people to enter it. And we've outlined some specific groups and beliefs and things to make sure that everybody across the board is allowed. This shows that the library in the usage of the meeting room is being open and progressive and supportive and safe. Secondly, we address that the library is not endorsing the work that is going on in the meeting room. By separating it and simply it being a space that the library happens to provide, we allow the library to do so in a way that is distant and does not endorse views that could be hateful or cruel. We also, among other things, one common way that meeting room policies have been written is to remove the ability for things to be posted inside the meeting room. It's very common that many hate groups will hang large banners, Confederate flags, other hate symbols. And to minimize that for all, yes, that is a little bit of a tough thing for some groups, but ultimately in this case, it harms the hate groups more than it would harm a general user. So by creating such a requirement, it allows the library to minimize large hate speech within the meeting room. Of course, illegal activities are not allowed, and really narrowing down what the meeting room is being used for is important. This isn't just a room for any purpose. This is a room for education, information, communities coming together in a positive way, and really focusing on that. And also important to make sure that the policy includes something that addresses gatherings that may get out of control. If police need to be involved, law enforcement, if somewhere, that there's something very clear in here that addresses, again, behavior outside of just the behavioral code of conduct. So this is a general solid outline of a meeting room policy, but as I mentioned, we also need to make sure that we are assessing this on a regular basis. So this policy needs to be reviewed regularly with whoever is approving it, with the staff who are actually doing the day-to-day work with people who are using the meeting room. So that's my presentation. This is a difficult dilemma to address. Again, the goal here through this consequentialist lens is not to write something that solves this problem. It's something that minimizes the harms that a hate group may provide in a public library while still keeping the important public library open and running and working. One thing I'll add at the end of this presentation is that I'm appreciative of the ability to see this particular dilemma through a framework, because I think if I had addressed it outside of such a framework, it would have been easy to say I was copying out by writing a policy that doesn't do anything to the hate groups, or doesn't, just this midline compromise of a policy. And that's not what this is. With the framework of consequentialism, it becomes something that is more than that. It becomes something that is ethically sound and has a goal as it's being written. This is not a compromise. This is something being written with standards in place to remove as much hate from libraries as possible. Thanks so much for the opportunity for this presentation. Have a wonderful evening.